What's up, fellow coders? Welcome to another exciting adventure in quick tech tutorials. We'll make it quick. Hello once again, everybody, and welcome back. Today what I'm going to do is start a series on debugging auto layout constraints. And this first part, I want to go over more or less what we are going to view from a storyboards perspective, as well as what the rules are that pretty much govern what needs to happen for auto layout constraints to be valid. So over here, we can see that we have these conflicting constraints, we have these missing constraints, we have our storyboard showing us issues in red, and then we have down in the debugging output, the dreaded UI view, very verbose, debug logs. Verbose, yes, but also very helpful. So the first part of this series is going to be, like I said, in reference to what happens up here in storyboard, more or less, dealing with the errors from this perspective. In later videos in this series, I will get into reading these actual constraint debug logs. So if this is your main concern is reading these error logs, then that's going to be in a later series. So anyways, let's go ahead and get started. One thing I do want to point out about this project is if I go into my product scheme, edit schema, you do not see my environment variable of OS activity mode set to disable. And the reason I don't set that to disable is because I want to be able to see these debug printouts for this tutorial. So anyways, let's go ahead and clean this storyboard up. We'll just kind of start new. I can select it. And all I'm going to do is drop a UI view onto my single view controller's view. I'll give it a color, just simply something so we can see it. That's as good as any. So let's go ahead and look and see what we need from a constraints perspective. And what I want to do, just to make this tutorial a little bit easier to understand, is I'm going to work on one axis at a time. So the first part of this video, I'm going to be talking strictly about the horizontal axis, and the vertical axis follows the same rule set, but again, I just want to talk about one at a time. So what I'm going to do first is give this view initial values for the height and the top. So I now have valid vertical constraints. And I'm sorry guys, but that color is really just an eyesore. So something a little better. So when I'm looking at this storyboard, I can already see that I have my errors. And even though I have a height and a top, what it's saying that I'm missing is a X position and a width. So again, we're dealing with the X position and the width, two constraints that I would need for my horizontal plane. So let's go ahead and give it an initial one of a leading space. And now you can see here that it's saying that it doesn't have a valid width. While that is absolutely true, doesn't necessarily mean I have to give it a width constraint. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and give it a trailing constraint. Everything goes away. It looks happy. One thing to keep in mind is these constraints are basically values that are put into linear algebra equations. And essentially, if the numeric values are determined to be valid and there's pretty much only one way to come up with a given answer, then everything's fine. If we start adding in multiple constraints, and we'll see this later on, where there may be two different ways to determine the leading width of this view, then it has multiple variables that it can put in there, and it doesn't really necessarily know which one to choose for leading, so it kind of has to start guessing. That's when we start getting those ambiguous layouts and those conflicts. So let's go ahead and take a look at this one really quick. And as we can see, everything lays out just fine. We have our leading, we have our trailing, we have our top, and we have our height. So when it said a moment ago that it needed a width, basically what I was saying is it needs a way to be able to calculate up a valid width. So a leading and a trailing give it those constraints where it can figure out the rest. So let's take a look and see what that's all about and what the rules are. Okay, so let's talk about horizontal constraints. The first thing we need to make sure of is that we have two of the required constraints on any given plane. So in this case, the horizontal plane, we need to have at least a leading and a trailing, or a width, a center. We need to have two. Now, when we have less than two, we usually have insufficient constraints, and when we have more than the required two, we can oftentimes wind up with ambiguous constraints. So when we look at this picture right here, we see that we have leading, width, trailing, and center X. Those are the four options we have to get our view laid out horizontally. So when we talk about the two required constraints, what we're going to look at are the various ways we can satisfy those two required constraints. For example, here we could do a leading constraint, and then we could do a width constraint, and therefore the auto layout engine would be able to deduce the trailing constraints value. Also, what we could look at for the other type of layouts to satisfy the two required constraints, we could do a trailing constraint, we could do a width constraint, and based off those two constraints, the auto layout engine can determine or deduce the leading constraint. So for example, if we had a trailing constraint of 100, a width of 150, the layout engine could deduce the leading constraint of 150. Here, if we have a leading constraint, and then we provide a trailing constraint, then the auto layout engine can deduce the width constraint. So if we had a leading constraint of 100, a trailing constraint of 150, we would be able to deduce that the width would be 150. In this case, we're looking at the 400 as the total value. Now, if I center the view, then what I'm going to do is provide a width. And with those two constraints for the center X and the width, the auto layout engine can deduce the leading constraint along with the trailing constraint. So here, when we look at our horizontal constraints, we need a leading, trailing, width, center. We need to be able to deduce two of the others from the two that we provide. One thing I'd like to point out is if a view has an intrinsic content size, it takes care of one of the constraints on the plane, horizontal or vertical, for you already. Okay, so we're back here at our storyboard. Let's go ahead and nuke the leading constraint, the trailing constraint. Let's nuke it. And what I want to do now is, I'm going to leave that over there just to show you guys another point here. I'm going to go ahead and center that horizontally and give it a width. Now you can see that my errors change from red to yellow. This is warnings, and the warnings just simply say that the frame doesn't line up where the constraints say it should. So I'm just going to go ahead and update that frame. Now what I'm going to do here is give it a leading constraint as well, leading space. So now I have three constraints on the horizontal plane, and nothing's complaining. Everything seems like it's just fine. So let's go ahead and run that. And as you can see, everything does lay out just fine. There's no errors. There's no errors in the storyboard, no printouts. Everything looks good. Now let's go ahead and rotate it. And all of a sudden, there are issues. And what the issues are saying are we have conflicts up here. Basically, there's more than one variable to get plugged into those equations to determine the leading space of this UI view. And so what it's saying is the variable that represents the width at 240 is going to go ahead and get thrown out. So you'll see here that the view is still centered and the width is gone, but I maintained a leading and a trailing, in this case of 51.5. So my view is indeed centered. That is what you'll start seeing when you have the multiple constraints on a given axis. And the fact that here on the x-axis I have three constraints. I have the leading, the width, and the center, and that just causes the conflict. So once again, if I look at this, there's no warning, so it might kind of seem that everything should work just fine, but you'll notice down here for my size class I have a compact width and a regular height. And in that case, it does actually work out as long as the value is 51.5 for that leading constraint. If I go ahead and put that in at 98, you will see that storyboard does in fact give us the information we need for those conflicts. And it's saying these conflicts, these constraints conflict, so we can choose one or more to delete. If we don't do that and we choose to run it with this error, then as we saw a moment ago, the auto layout engine will choose to nuke one for us. Furthermore, if I go ahead and I put that leading back to 51.5 and I change my size class, then you can see that once again, there's the issue. It's showing me once again that I have those conflicts and I can choose to remove one or more. And if I don't, Auto Layout Engine will choose one for me. So let's go ahead now and talk about the vertical axis. So okay, for the vertical plane, we're going to look at the top and the height and the bottom. Here, if I have a top and a height constraint, then the bottom constraint can be deduced for me because I have 2 of the required 4. Now, if I have the view set up additionally, I can have a height and a bottom, and I can deduce the top, as well as I can have a top and a bottom, and we can deduce the height, as well as I can have a centered on the y-axis, along with a height value, which allows the Auto Layout Engine to deduce the top and the bottom required constraints. So again, 2 required constraints allow me to deduce the other 2 available constraints on that plane. So here, we're looking at the top, the bottom, height, and center vertically. Again, if I provide 2, I can deduce the other 2 constraints, in this case on the vertical plane. Okay, so we're back here at our storyboard, and I'm just going to clear out all my constraints, and now we're going to talk about the vertical axis. So I'm going to give the view valid horizontal axes in the leading as well as the trailing, and now we'll just talk about the vertical. So here, my vertical, if I go to the top and I give it a height, everything looks just fine. We'll go ahead and run this. So once again, in horizontal or portrait or landscape, I have my top view, I have my height, I have my leading view, and I have my trailing view. Here, everything lays out just fine. I have my 2 horizontal and my 2 vertical constraints. Let's take a look and pay attention to one other aspect. If I have my height and I go ahead and I put in let's say I give it a bottom constraint. So now I have the issue of multiple constraints or more than 2 constraints on a given axis, and let's see what happens there. So here, everything looks like it might be just fine, and let's go ahead and rotate. And that one disappeared on us, and we have a lot of issues going on down here. We have broken constraints for height, and let's see, we have another constraint broken for this is the bottom of the view. So basically it's saying that there's no way that all these constraints right here can possibly exist with a height of 128, the top value, and to the bottom. So if we come back over into our storyboard and we go ahead and lay this one out, over here we'll see the conflicting constraints once again. And again, we can choose to break one or not. Let's go ahead and break the bottom because that one is giving us the most problems because it's such a huge value. We'll go ahead and delete that constraint. Everything goes back. Everything seems happy. Let's run it. And here we are in our portrait. We go over to landscape, and once again, we're back to where we were for the top, the height, the leading, and the trailing. It's upside down. So when we come back over into our storyboard, what we're going to go over in the next tutorial is how to deal with the issue when we do have that bottom constraint in there. When we have something like this and we wind up with a constraint that we actually do need, we're going to look at some of the techniques that we can use to actually have this kind of flexible layout actually work for us. But again, that's going to be in the next tutorial because I cannot possibly get that in within 15 minutes for what I already have. So anyways, this is the initial video for this tutorial series. And basically what I'd like you to take away from this is the rules of 2 constraints per axis. And like I said, in the next one, we'll deal with some of the techniques we can use if we do need these other constraints in there. So anyways, I hope that helps somebody out. And let me know down in the comments what else you'd like to see. By all means, subscribe so you get notified of the information as quickly as possible. And thanks again for stopping by, everybody.